Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosophers' Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. René Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650, is largely regarded as the grandfather of modern philosophy. This is in addition to him being also famous as a mathematician and man of letters. In 1641, he published what would be his most important philosophical work, Meditationes de Prima Philosophia, or Meditations on First Philosophy. The first philosophy part refers to the department of metaphysics, which is also called first philosophy due to it dealing with first principles or matters most fundamental. In this book, Descartes will deal with the question of the reality of what exists both inside and outside ourselves, and how we can be certain about our beliefs pertaining to it. Descartes starts off with the idea of trying to put the sciences and metaphysics on a firm foundation. His method of doubt is to free us from preconceived opinions and allow us to seek a truth that could never be doubted, to serve as a basis for philosophical reasoning. In search for an indubitable truth that can serve as such a foundation, he will bring into question the reality of the world, God, and even himself, before settling upon something he thinks he could never doubt in the slightest. He remarks that throughout his life, he had been struck by how many falsehoods get into our set of commonly accepted opinions, but decided to delay the project until he had reached some mature age. In destroying preconceived opinions, he says we do not need to list and destroy all of them, but to show that we can doubt those beliefs that are their foundation, with what rests upon it, then collapsing. We also need not demand proof that something is false in order to bring it into doubt at this stage. His criterion for doubting something and ruling it out will be if he does not have a clear and distinct understanding of its truth. The establishment of what is to be doubted is the subject of the first of 6 meditations. Descartes starts with the observation that much of what he had up until this point accepted as most true had been given to him through the experiences of his senses. We are subjected to illusions through the senses, such that, for instance, a large object seems small at a distance. Finding that senses sometimes deceive, he says, it is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. The knowledge that we get through our senses includes not just the apparent size of a particular object, but also his belief that he is currently sitting by the fire, thinking these things through, wearing a winter dressing gown with a piece of paper in his hand. Descartes admits that it may seem insane to many people at first to suggest that he should doubt that those hands are part of his whole body that belongs to him, and that the paper the hand holds is also real. Yet he also believes these things can be doubted at least at this stage of his method. So he will bring out 2 arguments to justify his doubt in the external world and show that its reality is not so clear and distinct to the understanding. The justifications are known as the dream argument and the evil genius argument. The dream argument asserts that our dreams are often so vivid and lifelike that I do not really know right now that I am not currently asleep, dreaming I am doing what I think I am doing. We have many of the same experiences in dreams as when we are awake, such as when he dreams he is sitting by the fire. So there seems to be no sure sign that Descartes can use to determine that he is awake. Visions in dreams may represent something real, but what kind of reality is it that they would represent? These visions are like paintings in a way. Paintings can contain parts of a creature that are real in creating something unreal but not totally new, such as a centaur. Even if eyes, hands, arms are imaginary, simpler things like colors would still be real, and are the things from which we form an image. Corporeal nature and its extensions in bodies are abstractions from simpler elements that allow us to discern shapes. A reasonable conclusion from this is that physics, astronomy, and medicine are doubtful, while geometry and arithmetic are not. Geometry and arithmetic are about things that will remain true even when asleep. They contain something undoubtable, even if about unreal things, that 2 of them added to 5 of them will still total 7, even while asleep. But even about these things, Descartes says we may be deceived. Here, in the later stage of his first meditation, he starts building his evil genius argument, ultimately because he can't have an evil God argument. Descartes admits he is a finite being, thus imperfect, and posits the possibility that he may be so imperfect that he might be deceived all the time and not know it. He does not know for certain that God has not brought it about that an earth, a sky, extended things that all do not exist, nevertheless appear to him. Yet this seems to be inconsistent with the goodness of God. If God is supremely good, he may not wish that we be deceived even about what 2 and 3 add up to, or about how many sides a square may have. At the same time, God has clearly made us imperfect, and it can be wondered whether that is consistent with God's perfection. Either way, Descartes leaves this issue for a later time and proceeds on the idea that God has saw fit to have us be imperfect and deceived, at least on occasion. So at this point, let us not even argue with those who say there is no God, and proceed from the situation in which Descartes finds himself. Descartes now admits that none of his former beliefs are beyond some doubt that can be raised for well thought out reasons. He says, "So in the future I must withhold my assent from these former beliefs, just as carefully as I would from obvious falsehoods, if I want to discover any certainty. Also because it is a matter of long established habit and custom to assent to opinions that are highly probable. Descartes says he must have a principle in this exercise of doubt to turn this tendency in the opposite direction, at the risk of deceiving himself, and take the position that he cannot go too far in this distrustful attitude. So his principle that he will adopt in his method of doubt will be his evil genius argument. In his own words, "I will suppose, therefore, that not God, who is supremely good and the source of truth, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning, has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the delusion of dreams, which he has devised to ensnare my judgment." Even the body that seems so intimately attached to him as uniquely his, Descartes shall deem to be the fabrication of the demon in order to deceive him. The short answer to the question of how Descartes will re-establish his belief in things other than himself is that he will argue that his idea of those things are not solely his creation, and that God is no deceiver. For now, when we move out of the body and extended objects and look toward God, we find that I may be the creator of my thoughts about God. If I am the creator of my ideas of God, must I then be something, or does it follow that I might not exist? If I conceived myself as something, then I actually existed. Even if a deceiver was deceiving me, in that case too I existed, so long as I am something. Even if this something is being deceived, Descartes will have an argument. And I will get it for you. But there is a deceiver of supreme power and cunning who is deliberately and constantly deceiving me. In that case, too, I undoubtedly exist, if he is deceiving me. and let him deceive me as much as he can. He will never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I think I am something. So after considering everything very thoroughly, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. Descartes' more famous formulation of this is to be found in his earlier Discourse on Method, where in French he expresses this idea as je pense donc je suis. I think, or I am thinking, therefore I am. Regardless of the formulation of the argument, that if I think I exist, then at least as long as I'm thinking, I must exist, is his point. It does not mean that I must be thinking in order to exist, but that I must exist in order to think, and so, therefore, the thought proves I exist. Often with the Latin cogito for I think, the argument is referred to as the Cartesian cogito, or just the cogito, as short for cogito ergo sum. But now that I have been proven to exist, at least while thinking, the question now to ask is what exactly this I is. If we continue on the quest for only truths that are certain, we must remove from this I everything that is not certain and unshakable. This means that at this point Descartes will not move to calling himself man or rational animal, because then he would have to imagine what those things are, with only bare existence of thought to guide him. What else can he say about himself with certainty, other than that he thinks and therefore exists? A couple of possibilities for expanding the I come to mind from what had been doubted. One thought is that of having a body, and another is engaging in sense perception and thinking, which are attributes of the soul. When we think of soul, it is of something tenuous like ether that permeates the body parts. Also, sense perception seems to make no sense without a body, but also occurs in dreams. As for the body, we think of it as having shape and contours, occupying space. It seems to be a different thing from thought, with powers of self-movement and perception foreign to it. So it seems at this point, especially with the deceiving demons still on the prowl, we cannot yet connect what an I is with body or soul. However, with thinking, Descartes has something that is inseparable from the I, for at least as long as the I thinks. Therefore, the I that thinks is mind, intelligence, reason. Descartes states, I am then, in the strict sense, only a thing that thinks. That is, I am a mind, or intelligence, or intellect, or reason. Of the I, it is certain that knowledge of it will not depend on things whose existence I am unaware, or on what I may invent in my imagination. Imaginations cannot therefore grant knowledge of myself and give an answer to the what of the I. In a broad sense, the thing that thinks includes willing, doubting, denying, imagining, perceiving. Since this is a considerable list, we can consider if it is the same I doing all of these things. Descartes believes it is clearly evident that it is the same I doing these things, and also having sense perceptions in sleep, even if there is no real object. Despite this being the same I doing these things, it is not itself directly perceived and cannot be pictured in imagination. Descartes suggests here that despite their reality being doubtable, it seems that the corporeal things of which images are formed in my thought are known with more distinctness. Certainly people think we understand most distinctly bodies that we can touch and see, such as a piece of wax. Yet Descartes will argue that the nature of objects is perceived by the mind alone. It is the general thesis of the second meditation that we know our minds better and more distinctly than we know our bodies or bodies outside of us. When we turn to the piece of wax, it has several properties. It has color, shape, size, smell, and it makes a sound if you knock it. Put it close to the fire and things begin to change, but the wax remains as it alters in size and shape. Perhaps the wax was not any of those sensory delights, but a body that presents itself in various forms. If we take away everything that belongs to the wax, we have something extended, but also flexible and changeable. Due to its many possible shapes, it is not my imagination giving me a grasp of the wax being flexible and changeable. It gets extended in different ways if heated, more ways than I can imagine. What are we to make of the fact that it is the same wax throughout the process? The conclusion Descartes draws is that the nature of wax is perceived by the mind alone. It is not a matter of vision, touch, imagination, but a purely mental scrutiny that we think of it being the same wax. We say that we see the wax itself, not that we judge it to be thus by color and shape, which might lead us to believe that it came from the eyes, rather than from the mental scrutiny. But Descartes will argue that it is not just with the color or shape of the wax when we make such judgments. And I will consult what he says here. When we say that we see the wax itself, if it is there before us, not that we judge it to be there from its color or shape. And this might lead me to conclude without more ado that knowledge of the wax comes from what the eye sees, EYE, and not from the scrutiny of the mind alone. But then if I look out the window and see men crossing the square, as I just happened to have done, I normally say that I see the men themselves, just as I say that I see the wax. Yet, do I see any more than hats and coats which could conceal automatons? I judge that they are men. And so something which I thought I was seeing with my eyes is in fact grasped solely by the faculty of judgment which is in my mind. However, ordinary ways of talking do not prove this. We need to consider where the perception of the nature of wax is most perfect and evident. Descartes' question here is whether his understanding of the nature of wax was more clear and distinct when just perceiving it through the senses, through common sense or imagination, or after having applied judgment to it, using the metaphor of having taken off its clothes and looking at it naked. He believes there is no distinctness in the level of perception that any animal may possess. The formal knowledge of the nature of the thing that requires a mind is more distinct. Going back to what was considered before, my awareness of my own self should be more certain, distinct, and evident than my awareness of the wax. Normally, I judge the wax to exist because I see it. The same result follows that I exist, and thus still know myself more distinctly. Any consideration of the body will establish the mind. Bodies are not strictly perceived by the senses or the faculty of imagination, but by intellect alone. Regarding bodies outside the mind, Descartes concludes that I now know that even bodies are not strictly perceived by the senses or the faculty of imagination, but by the intellect alone, and that this perception derives not from their being touched or seen, but from their being understood. And in view of this, I know plainly that I can achieve an easier and more evident perception of my own mind than of anything else. What Descartes is not doing here is proclaiming that he or anyone else can see what he wants to see, or concluding that objects exist only in the mind. Instead, he is talking about the final mental act of a series that starts with sensations in the sense organs, for example, patterns of light in the eye, and leads to a nonverbal "there is a piece of wax" in judgment. His position is that the final act of the process is what should be given the name of perception. Before this, there is something he calls imagination, or sometimes called common sense, where the integration of the different sensations from different sense organs can occur. So far, this is Descartes' preliminary account of sense experience. That I know my own mind more clearly than I know my body or an object was Descartes' thesis of meditation 2. A second theme emerging out of it may be called his rationalism, consisting in his arguments for the idea that it is by faculty of judgment, rather than by sensation or imagination, by an operation of the mind, that we know about the world. In the history of philosophy, Descartes is considered the first in the movement of rationalist philosophers, believing that our knowledge of the world comes from mental scrutiny, independent of sense experience. So far, the only thing of which Descartes is certain is that he is a thinking thing. He starts his third meditation with the argument that if what he perceived with such clarity and distinctness were false, then he would not be certain of his existence. The clarity and distinctness would be insufficient to provide certainty. So he lays it down as a general rule that what he perceives very clearly and distinctly is true. Descartes does not define these terms in the meditation, although the way he uses them gives us a good idea of what he means. In his Principles of Philosophy in 1644, he defines a clear perception as one that is present and accessible with sufficient force to the attentive mind. It becomes distinct when clear enough that it cannot be confused with another because it is sharply separated from anything else. In geometry and arithmetic, we also see things so clearly that could only be false if God was acting to deceive us. Yet even if God were a deceiver, he could not bring it about that I am nothing when I think I exist, make it true in the future that I never did exist, or bring it about that 2 added to 3 come to a total other than 5. These things seem clear enough to potentially remove the possibility of being deceived by God or by another powerful being, at least about these matters. To remove the remaining doubts, we will need to examine whether God exists and whether there can be a deceiver. The source of our thought about objects is images. When I think of man, chimera, the sky, the thought is appropriate for the term idea. When I will, fear, affirm or deny, there is a thing I take to be the object of my thought, although my thought may contain more than its likeness. The ideas, when considered solely in themselves, are never false. Will and emotions in themselves are also never false. Only judgments can be false, and the most common mistake consists in judging that the ideas that are in me represent or conform to things outside of me. The ideas in themselves do not appear to be in error. From without come ideas of hearing a noise, seeing the sun, feeling the heat of the fire, and from inventiveness can come ideas of sirens and hippogriffs. A question now emerges about ideas derived from outside. What is the reason for believing that they resemble the things of which they are representations? Here we have a picture often called the subject-object dichotomy. Within the subject or thinker is an idea or representation of a thing outside of the mind that may exist independently, presumably in real time and space, and be there for other subjects to perceive. The subject only has direct access to the idea of the object. If we just assume that the object transmits its image, sound, feeling to us in an accurate way, then it seems reasonable to believe that the objects do exist independently, and that they are what we see them to be. But what is the origin of this assumption? Descartes suggests that it is not a revelation of truth by natural light, but a spontaneous impulse to believe the information of our senses. His rhetorical question is, if natural impulses are capable of pushing us in the wrong direction and steering us away from the good, why can we not in the same way be steered away from the true? He has two ideas of the sun, one from his senses that suggests that it is very small, and another from his knowledge of astronomy that suggests it is very large. Descartes says of the two ideas, obviously both these ideas cannot resemble the sun, which exists outside of me, and reason persuades me that this idea, which seems to have emanated most directly from the sun itself, has in fact no resemblance to it at all. His conclusion from these considerations is that it was blind impulse that had him believing that external entities distinct from himself exist and transmit their ideas or images to him through his sense organs. When considered as modes of thought, our ideas appear to be equal and from within, but different ideas can represent different things. What Descartes has in mind here is the distinction between ideas of a substance and ideas of its properties. A substance is an entity that is capable of existing independently of other entities, although another entity may have brought it into existence. Once existing, it endures. We can then describe it by attaching properties to it, such as shape, size, color, that are not themselves substances. Here Descartes will follow the idea of a chain of being in claiming that ideas, conceived as images or representations, ideas of substances will have more objective reality than ideas of properties. And likewise, an idea of a supreme God will have more objective reality than ideas that represent finite substances. But why must ideas not be equal in their reality? Just because they might represent things of different levels of reality? According to Descartes, it will be related to causation. A cause must be as real or more real than its effect. This must be true of the objective reality, the reality of an idea of something as idea, as well as the formal reality of a thing existing independently. My idea of heat or of a stone must have a cause that has as much reality. The idea did not arise from nothing. The cause of a stone must be as real and contain everything that is in the stone. Otherwise, the stone came from nothing. In other cases, the cause not transferring its reality to the idea does not prove the cause to be any less real. Descartes will now draw a distinction between the formal and the objective reality of an idea, with the formal mode referring to the causes of ideas. For formal reality, the idea derives it from the mode of thought, for instance, that the coats and hats contain men. It derives its objective reality from a cause that has as much formal reality present in it. What happens when the cause of idea contains another idea? Descartes says that although one idea may perhaps originate from another, there cannot be an infinite regress here. Eventually one must reach a primary idea, the cause of which will be like an archetype. This archetype will contain all the reality and perfection that is objectively present in the idea. Therefore, ideas are like images that can fall short of the perfection of the things from which they are taken. With this, Descartes progresses to where he wanted to go after establishing himself as the thinking thing, namely to the argument that this thinking thing cannot be the only thing that exists. Descartes' refutation of only he existing is that if the objective reality of my ideas were to be so great that I am sure that the same reality does not exist in me, and hence that I cannot be its cause, then I am not alone. The cause of the idea must also exist. However, if there is no such idea in me that has a cause from without, I have no way of convincing myself in the falsity of a belief that I alone exist. His list of other possible existing things and causes of his ideas include God, angels, corporeal things, animals, and other men. There is only a small list of what we perceive clearly and distinctly in corporeal things: extension, position, motion, substance, duration, number. Tactile qualities are obscure and confused. Particularly ideas of hot and cold contain so little clarity that I cannot perceive if cold is the absence of heat or vice versa, or whether either quality is a real quality. Other unclear ideas include light and colors, sounds, smell, and taste. Even those qualities that we perceive clearly and distinctly do not require us to posit another source outside of the mind to be their causes. Such ideas are not so great that they could not have their origin in me. As for clear and distinct elements of substance, duration, and number, I could be borrowing these ideas from the idea of myself and projecting them onto the stone. Other ideas such as extension, shape, position, and movement could have originated in the mind. However, when I consider my idea of God, could my ideas of God have originated only in myself? Or must God exist in order to explain the origin of this idea? Whereby God I mean infinite substance, eternal, immutable, independent, the supreme intellect and power that is the ground of all being. Descartes believes it is improbable that those ideas could have originated solely in him. And so he concludes that by the word God, I understand a substance that is infinite, eternal, immutable, independent, supremely intelligent, supremely powerful, and which created both myself and everything else, if anything else there be, that exists. All these attributes are such that the more carefully I concentrate on them, the less possible it seems that they could have originated from me alone. So from what has been said, it must be concluded that God necessarily exists. Descartes is here contending that our idea of the infinite must actually come from something that is infinite, rather than by negating the finite. We understand more reality in an infinite substance. Because it is more real, my perception of the infinite is prior to my perception of the finite. Also, I would not understand my imperfections without an idea of a more perfect being by comparison. Unlike ideas of hot and cold, my idea of God is clear and distinct and contains in itself more reality than any other idea. All reality, truth, and perfection is contained in the idea of God. It does not matter that I cannot grasp the infinite, because I know these attributes to be present in God, formally or eminently. And so my idea of God is the truest, most clear, and distinct of all my ideas. Descartes now presents more reasons for God in refuting the idea that he could have created himself. Recalling what was said about sense experience, the idea of something more perfect must come from something more perfect, in order to have as much reality in the cause. So how could I otherwise exist if all of this is within me? If I derived my existence from myself, I should have given myself all of the perfections of which I have an idea. But in that case, I would be God. Since the same power and acts are always needed to preserve me, supposing that I always existed does not escape the force of this argument. Ultimately, the distinction between creation and preservation is merely conceptual. Had I created myself out of nothing, I would be factually aware of it, and my lack of awareness of this implies that I depend for my existence on a being other than myself. But if a being is not its own cause, the same question would have to be repeated until an ultimate cause is found, which is God. Because we are dealing with persons as well as causes that create, there can be no infinite regress. It also cannot be a case of several partial causes, because that would lack the unity of perfection in one being, which is one of God's perfections. Since I am a thinking thing and have within me some idea of God, what caused me is itself a thinking thing and possesses the idea of all perfections of God. So Descartes says altogether that the mere fact that I exist and have within me an idea of a most perfect being, that is, God, provides a very clear proof that God indeed exists. This idea, Descartes argues, must be innate in us because it is not given in sense experience and is not invented by us. Descartes' theory of innate ideas is not a belief that we have beliefs at birth. What he has in mind is more like a belief that if a clear and distinct idea is explained to us, we will assent to it as self-evident, although we must gain an understanding of it first. It comes from the idea of being implanted by nature. And this fits into the picture of the greatness of God. It should not be a surprise that God, in creating me, would put this idea in me when I am created in His image and likeness. Descartes summarizes this in a statement that the whole force of the argument lies in this. I recognize that it would be impossible for me to exist with the kind of nature I have, that is, having within me the idea of God, were it not the case that God really existed. The fourth meditation, about truth and falsity, deals with a possible problem mentioned earlier, that even though God is perfect, He creates what is not perfect, and it may be questioned whether that is consistent with His nature. By this I mean that God would be more perfect if His creations were also perfect. For Descartes, just as we do not seek final causes or purposes in physics, we accept that we do not understand God's reasons. Being man, I exist between God and nothingness, between supreme being and non-being. As finite being, my errors have two causes: my fallible faculty of judgment and my will. If my faculty of judgment were improved to infinity, it would perceive itself to belong to the nature of God. If I always choose what is good and do good, I would never be free. To avoid error, the intellect should always precede the determination of the will. Error is the incorrect use of free will. It is an imperfection of will that I misuse my freedom and make judgment about what I do not understand. We should instead withhold judgment about any matter where the truth is not clear. I arrive at truth when I give sufficient attention to all things that I perfectly understand. Every clear and distinct perception is undoubtedly something and must have God as its author. Accordingly, Descartes will consider what objects outside of him are distinct or confused. Continuous quantity is something I can distinctly imagine in terms of extension, shape, dimension, position, motion, duration. I perceive them in an object clearly together. As I do so, it seems like I am remembering rather than learning something new. Most importantly, I have many ideas of things that may not exist but are not nothing, such as a triangle. The triangle has perceivable properties and also an essence that is independent of and not determined by me. Descartes is here inferring a reality of the properties of things based on a clearly and distinctly perceiving them. Thus he can formulate another proof of God. Just as angles cannot be separated from the essence of triangles, and mountains not thought without valleys, I cannot think God's essence without existence. Existence is inseparable from God, and therefore he does exist. It seems to be an innate idea. Descartes points to 3 reasons why this argument should be convincing. First, there is nothing else I can think of whose existence belongs to its essence. There can only be one of this type that has always existed from eternity. And, finally, I perceive many attributes of God, none of which I can remove or alter. Once God's existence is proven, it is as certain as mathematics, and we can believe it as strongly. Pythagorean theorem will also be accepted strongly once adequately explained. The existence of God needed some close attention to be known, just as would a mathematical formula. Descartes further claims that in proving God's existence, we come to where nothing can be more self-evident. He doesn't just say he is certain of God's existence, but also adds that, what is more, I see that the certainty of all other things depend on this, so that without it, nothing can ever be perfectly known. My nature is such that as long as I perceive something clearly and distinctly, I cannot but believe it to be true. I thus rely on God as guarantor that what I perceive this way actually is true, independently of what I am or am not inclined to believe. God exists with everything dependent upon him, and his not being a deceiver means that everything I clearly and distinctly perceive is necessarily true, even if I am no longer attending to the argument. I can remember this, and as long as I remember, I know it true and certain. Now that God is the source of our idea of him, and guarantor of all other ideas that are clear and distinct, we need not worry about the deceiving demon that Descartes posited earlier. And as for the dream argument, I will remain certain of clear and distinct ideas even in dreams, due to my awareness of God. Now that Descartes has removed the doubt from the existence of the mind, God, and mathematical objects, what remains for the final meditation is the reality of matter and the body. He will explore the relationship between mind and body, which I will leave as a different topic. For my purposes here, I will finish his doubt project with the existence of matter. God is capable of creating material things, and the faculty of imagination suggests that they are real. It is the faculty of imagination being applied to a body present to it. It can also put geometrical figures in the mind's eye. If a body is attached to my mind, I can contemplate it, and it becomes possible that the body allows me to imagine corporeal things. When the mind understands, it turns inward, inspecting its ideas. When the mind imagines the body, it confers an idea that is understood by the mind and perceived by the senses. So if the body exists, it explains how imagination comes about. Descartes now concludes that he has a probable conjecture that the body exists. But he does not want to say that we yet have a distinct idea of corporeal nature in imagination that can give us an inference that is necessarily true. Besides objects of pure mathematics, I also imagine colors, sounds, tastes through the sensations. I perceive through sense parts of my body and its sensations of pleasure, pain, hunger. Sensations of light, colors, sound allow me to distinguish sky, the seas, the earth from one another. These things are thought distinct from the objects of thought that were producing the ideas. For it seems involuntary that I see something when it is there, even when I do not want to see it. What I perceive through the senses is more lively, vivid, and more distinct than when formed through memory, and so cannot come from within me. Descartes recalls the reasons why, before the project of doubt, he had a propensity to believe in the information of his senses, and the reasons why he brought it into doubt. He is now ready to construct a conclusion of a kind of middle ground, where we do not always accept or doubt everything from the senses. He does not need an extreme position, because not everything from the senses is clear and distinct. Everything I clearly and distinctly understand is capable of being created by God as corresponding to my understanding. Faculties of things, such as changes in their shape and position, cannot be understood apart from some substance in which they inhere. They must be in a corporeal substance rather than an intellectual substance, because my conception of them includes extension. There must also be within us a capacity for receiving and recognizing ideas of sensible objects. Something must be active when perception is passive, and that active capacity cannot exist in me because it presupposes an intellectual act without my cooperation. Therefore, the ideas produced by this faculty come from another substance distinct from me, that contains all the reality which exists objectively in the idea. The other alternative is that these ideas come from God. But God has not given me a faculty for recognizing those ideas as coming from Him. Instead, I have a propensity to believe that these ideas come from the corporeal object. And so now Descartes can conclude the reality of corporeal things, or matter, and he says, so I do not see how God could be understood to be anything but a deceiver, if the ideas were transmitted from a source other than corporeal things. It follows that corporeal things exist. They may not all exist in a way that exactly corresponds with my sensory grasp of them, for in many cases the grasp of the senses is very obscure and confused. But at least they possess all the properties which I clearly and distinctly understand, that is, all those which, viewed in general terms, are comprised within the subject matter of pure mathematics. As for a short critical commentary, much of what Descartes argues focuses heavily on God, and he seems to lean on God quite heavily. I mentioned before how he recognizes that it might not be consistent for a perfect being to create imperfect beings, but he is satisfied that we do not understand God's reasons. However, I will add that once we define God as infinite, we do not understand him at all. And this opens the door to God being something that seems to us to be completely impossible and inconceivable. I will also add that much of his proof of God leans on the idea of two real things, one of which is more real than the other, two ideas or representations of things, one of which is more real than the other. It strikes me as a value judgment from a tradition of faith, and I see no reason to believe that metaphysical reality has to correspond to it. I think Descartes does an impressive job of arguing, and arguing for his existence, the existence of mathematical objects, and is having a more clear idea of his mind than of things outside of him. His theory of innate ideas, I think, needs more clarification and more argument, and it is sometimes mentioned in his other works. My take on that is that if there is something in the mind first at birth, it need only be a thought structure or a set of rules, rather than a propensity to believe a particular doctrine once it's explained. He hints at such a thing when he talks about how we must have a capacity to receive and recognize ideas from without, something like a thought structure. With that being said, I recommend Descartes be read in a collection that includes Meditations, Discourse on Method, and other works, where you can see the mind-body problem that is known as Cartesian dualism, his theory, free will, correct reasoning, and other theories of his. And with that, that's all for now. And if you like my videos, hit those like and subscribe buttons. Check out how to support my channel. Thanks for watching.